to 1 p.m. Central African Time on Channel Africa.
It is 18 after 12 Central African Time, and we're coming to you live from Johannesburg in South Africa. Now, Ghana recently hosted the High-Level Consultative Conference on Reparatory Justice in Accra, bringing together stakeholders to advance the global reparatory justice agenda and follow up on the United Nations General Assembly resolution on the Transatlantic Slave Trade. Speaking at the conference, Ghana's Foreign Affairs Minister Samuel Ablakwa said the campaign for reparations has gained unprecedented momentum since the adoption of the UN resolution in March. Meanwhile, South Africa's Minister in the Presidency for Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, Maropene Ramokgopa, reaffirmed the country's support for reparatory justice for Africa and people of African descent. And she now joins us. Minister, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us on Africa Update.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for having us on the program.
Now, Minister Ramokgopa, brief us on just the outcomes and commitments that came out of the Accra High-Level Consultative Conference that South Africa supports.
Thank you very much. The outcomes are quite exciting, and the commitments that we got from the participants, most especially as it relates to the UN and other international organizations, was quite heartwarming. But we also had countries from the Caribbean as well, who have actually played a very big role and also shared their 10-point plan that we are also going to be enshrining into our own program of action as it relates to how we actually carry on with this particular initiative. As you are, of course, aware, this initiative came a long way, and it was also building on some of the initiatives that took place. For example, the one that took place in Durban, the other one took place in Algiers, and of course, the recent one that took place in Togo, and later on the adoption of the culmination of this particular process being adopted by the AU, and also charging, of course, Ghana and giving them the position of champion in this particular matter. Later on, it went, of course, to the UN, and it was declared, and the resolution was taken at UNGA, where 123 countries actually adopted this particular resolution. So as a result, we have come up with the next step, where at first we do have a panel that was actually adopted yesterday, and one great South African was actually appointed in it, together with 6 head of states from Africa as well as from the Caribbean, who will then now be heading this particular matter and making sure that we monitor the implementation of the reparation process that we have put in place. The reparation process that we're looking at, of course, it is ensuring that we restore the artifacts that were taken, but equally so we open up trade barriers that were put in place. But in other instances, of course, the payment of the reparations that were done. We are going to do this, of course, by ensuring that we sit down and quantify the losses that Africa has actually suffered in the time of the continent's colonialization or colonialism. So this is where we are right now. The support is quite good. The commitment is quite good. There are few countries from the global north, for example, countries like France, that have come on board to say that they've actually started with the process. It was actually quite amazing to hear that there are some countries that haven't repealed, most especially in the global north, that haven't repealed their colonial laws that were actually quantifying Africans as a subhuman, in a form that they saw them as an asset rather than human beings. So that's what we have discussed and we have come up with in terms of the way forward as it relates to this conference.
And how do you prevent reparatory justice from becoming symbolic rather than resulting in measurable change? And what mechanisms would South Africa support to ensure accountability if states commit reparatory justice measures?
the team that has been put in place, the panel that have been put in place will have to be supported by South Africa, most especially because there is a South African that is actually being appointed by the president of Ghana to be part of that. South Africa has actually put in place a proposition where we were talking about how do we deal with the issue of making sure that when Africans speak on this particular matter of reparations, we don't only talk about what happened in the past, but we also talk about the legacy. Part of the legacy progress that we want to see is the issue of dealing away with the high cost of servicing of debt, which we are going to be pushing to ensure that this panel that was appointed yesterday will be making sure that it's part of the resolutions of the AU. As a result, we will be expecting countries to come up with a program of action that they will be putting in place so that we can then now be able to say, as Africa, we speak in one voice when we talk about our right to actually having the issue of the servicing of the debt being decreased so that we don't have to pay so much money in order for us to be able to raise debt. But secondly, as I've already said, the issue of trade barriers, we have to speak in one voice to say that if there are trade barriers that are imposed to another country, how do we then now deal with it? Of course, the issues of payment will also be coming on board, but this will be done through a rigorous plan of action that would then now be monitored, and a report will have to be looked at the level of the AU, and a team will be put in place to ensure that the monitoring of that actually happen. We have already seen, of course, countries of the global north, because we are actually looking for reparation from countries in the global north. We have already seen, as I've already said, progress as it relates to countries like France coming on board. So we will continue to monitor and also ensure that we support the South Africans that are serving in these platforms to be able to do their work and to ensure that we do actually get the justice that we need as it relates to reparation justice. So work has already been done. South Africa has played a very big role, even at the level of experts, of coming up with this concept of ensuring that this reparation justice actually become a success.
Minister Ramokgopa, going back to when U.S. President Donald Trump just imposed trade sanctions on African countries, different delegations from each country on the African continent, meaning the presidents went individually to address President Donald Trump and to gain his, for lack of a better word, his favor in ensuring that the tariffs that they were imposed on them were reduced and were not as severe as tariffs that a country like South Africa was given. Now, how do you ensure that the barriers that are going to be experienced now, all countries work together, and with Ghana leading in this instance, how do you then ensure that challenges that will be faced by individual countries don't separate the end goal?
One of the things that I must say is that I must actually applaud African countries was that as it relates to this particular matter, they stood together. All African countries stood together to actually support the resolution of this reparation at the UN level. So this is one of the things that shows you that we are actually going to stand together as it relates to this. Unfortunately, of course, 3 countries voted against this resolution, and USA was one of them. So you can already see that Africans have been able to speak in one voice as it relates to what they believe in. We just have to work together to ensure that we keep up with the momentum of ensuring that we stand together and we speak in one voice, because clearly, if we are divided as African countries, we are not going to be able to achieve anything. You can see, in fact, in how the issue of trade barriers was actually dealt with. Trying to deal with it as not as a united force have actually not been able to yield any fruit. So it just shows you that we have to have a resolution on the AU level, and whenever we negotiate, we have to negotiate as a unit, as African countries, so that we can also be able to garner support from other countries or other regions, for example, in the Caribbean, CARICOM, that would then now be able to come in and say that we will support you, we will stand with you. So the unity of African countries is actually sacrosanct. If we don't stand together, if we don't show that we are at one in whatever it is that we are going to be doing, we won't be able to achieve anything. We have already won the first leg. This is why now this conference is taking place, and it is actually the next step. So the only way that we can be able to deal with this matter is to stand as a unit, but also to be able to say, what does Africa have that other countries need, most especially countries in the global north? The issue of natural resources, the issue of making sure that we do speak in one voice as it relates to critical minerals will then now be able to help us to use it as a leverage that we can be able to negotiate in as a unit, not as individual countries. So the unity of African continent and all the other 55 countries standing together, speaking in one voice is quite important. And we have seen success already in this resolution being passed and this resolution actually having a program of action from the United Nations level. And what we have agreed upon will actually also be included in the statement that will be given at the UNGA level by the Secretary General.
Yeah.
Part of it
Well,
will
Minister
be the
Ramokgopa,
issue
we
of
have run
trade
out of time,
barriers.
but I have to ask very quickly before we wrap up, with the transatlantic stance and on slavery and everything that is happening now, and working in unison with the other African countries, when we look at a country like Namibia and the Hero and Nama genocide, where Germany had agreed to make reparations and pay for their involvement in that. Where does it stand now? Does this also become part of this particular, UNGA resolution? What is the way forward with them, since theirs was done a few years ago?
It is part of it because Namibia was actually represented here by its head of state, and part of the resolution actually include the progress that we have seen in how they handle the issue of Germany. So it will be part of the resolutions that will be taking to the UN to be read at UNGA as a statement by the UN Secretary General. So they are part of it from the onwards. When we started with this process, from the negotiations of the statement that will be adopted, they have been part of it and playing a very meaningful role, bringing, of course, the experience that they've had in them being able to achieve what they've been able to achieve.
Minister Ramokgopa, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us on Africa Update.
Thank you.
So South Africa's Minister in the Presidency for Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, Maropene Ramokgopa, joining us on the line. Our news headlines up next.
SABC News.